It was late September of 2013 when I decided to spend a few days alone at a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana. I had taken a few weeks off work, hoping to get away from noise, screens, and people. I wanted to clear my head, get some rest, and maybe do a bit of hiking. The cabin belonged to a friend of my uncle who rarely used it anymore. It sat about 20 miles from the nearest town and 6 miles off the main dirt road, tucked between thick pine trees and a stretch of rocky hills. There was no cell service, no electricity, just a small generator, a propane stove, and a hand pump for water outside. The drive there took most of the day. The closer I got, the thinner the roads became, gravel turning to dirt, then narrowing into a single winding path that looked barely driven on. When I reached the cabin, the air felt colder, sharper, like autumn had settled in heavier here than anywhere else. The place was small but solid, a square wooden structure with a steep roof, a short porch, and a few old chairs leaning against the railing. Behind it was a shed, half collapsed under the weight of years, and beyond that was nothing but trees, tall and dark and endless. I unloaded my things, got the generator running, and settled in. Inside, it smelled of dust and old pine. The furniture was simple. One bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a small wood stove in the corner. There were marks on the floor where mice had probably chewed through things at some point. The windows were small and slightly foggy from age, making everything outside look more distant. I spent the rest of that day stacking some wood, boiling water for coffee, and watching the sun disappear behind the trees. The first night was peaceful. I remember lying in bed with the faint hum of the generator outside, listening to the wind moving through the woods. It was quiet in a way you don't hear anywhere else. No traffic, no distant voices, just wind and the occasional creak of wood. I slept easily. The second night felt different. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a noise I couldn't place. It was faint at first, something like a dull thump against wood. I lay still, listening. The sound came again, closer, like something brushing or bumping the side of the cabin. My first thought was an animal. There were plenty of deer around, maybe even a bear. I stayed quiet, listening for movement. After a few minutes, it stopped. I eventually fell back asleep, telling myself it was nothing unusual. The next morning, I walked around the cabin just to check. The dirt was soft from the rain that had passed earlier that week, and near the side of the porch, I saw marks. Footprints, not animal ones. They looked human, but the pattern was strange. The soles had no defined tread, just flat impressions like someone had been walking barefoot through mud. I stood there for a while, staring at them, trying to make sense of it. The prints led from the trees toward the cabin, stopped near the porch, then turned back into the woods. It unsettled me, but I told myself it could have been from before I arrived. Maybe someone had been up here weeks ago. That day, I didn't go hiking like I planned. I stayed close, kept a small fire going, and checked the locks on the doors and windows. As the afternoon passed, I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. Every now and then I'd look toward the tree line, and it felt like something was there, just far enough to stay hidden. When night came again, I left the lantern burning longer than usual. Around midnight, the sound returned, softer this time, a dragging noise along the outer wall. My pulse started to race. I turned off the lantern and sat in the dark, trying to listen through the silence. I could hear faint steps in the dirt outside, slow and uneven, circling. Then there was a dull knock, 2 quick taps against the wooden siding. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. I waited until the noises faded away completely. The air inside felt heavy, thick with tension. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back to sleep, though it was shallow and restless. In the morning, I found more footprints, this time circling the entire cabin. I checked the door latch, it was still locked. But on the windowsill, there was a smudge, like someone's hand had rested there, faint fingerprints in the thin layer of dust. My chest tightened. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. The nearest property was miles away. I packed my things quickly that morning, planning to leave, but when I tried to start my truck, the battery was dead. I checked the hood, the connections, everything looked fine. It had started perfectly 2 days ago. The generator still worked, but I couldn't use it to charge the truck. I felt trapped. The dirt road was too long to walk safely back to the main road that day, and I didn't want to risk getting lost after dark. That evening, I sat on the porch with a small flashlight and the rifle the cabin owner had left behind. The forest looked endless under the fading light. Around sunset, I thought I saw something between the trees, something standing still. A figure, maybe, though it was too far and too shadowed to tell for sure. I raised the flashlight, but the beam barely reached that far. When I blinked, it was gone. I went inside and locked everything again. I didn't sleep that night. Around 3 a.m., the noises came back, heavier, more deliberate. Slow steps on the porch boards. I held the rifle tight, staring at the door, every muscle in my body frozen. The handle moved slightly, a quiet metal sound that sent chills through me. Then silence again. I didn't hear footsteps leaving, no movement in the dirt, just silence. The sun felt slow to rise that morning. When it did, I stepped outside carefully. The air was damp, and mist hung low around the trees. On the porch, right next to the door, was a small strip of torn fabric, dark and wet, like part of a shirt sleeve. I picked it up with shaking hands. It smelled faintly of sweat and soil. Whoever was out there had been inches from coming inside. I spent that day gathering everything I could carry, ready to walk back to the main road if I had to. Around noon, I decided to try the truck one more time. I don't know why, maybe just desperation, but when I turned the key, the engine started instantly. The relief that hit me was overwhelming. I didn't question it. I threw my bags into the seat, backed out fast, and didn't look in the mirrors until I reached the dirt road. When I finally got back to town, I stopped at a small diner, shaking from exhaustion and lack of sleep. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I didn't want to sound paranoid. I told myself it was maybe a trespasser, someone camping nearby, maybe even a hunter passing through. But in the days that followed, when I went through the photos I'd taken of the cabin area, I noticed something in one of them. A blurry shape between the trees, right where I had thought I'd seen someone standing that night. It wasn't clear enough to tell who or what it was, but it wasn't an animal. It was tall, human-shaped, and still. I deleted the photo after staring at it for too long. I never went back to that cabin. The owner sold it a year later after someone broke in and tore through the inside. They never caught whoever did it. Sometimes, when I think back to those nights, the part that stays with me the most isn't the noises or the footprints. It's that quiet moment when the door handle moved and then stopped. Like whoever was out there was waiting, listening, just on the other side of the wall. And the worst part is knowing that if the latch hadn't held that night, I probably wouldn't be here telling the story. It was late October of 2016 when I decided to drive out to northern Arizona and spend a few nights in an old cabin I had rented online. I was 32 at the time, tired of city noise and the endless hum of traffic. I wanted to get away, breathe in quiet air, maybe take some photos of the desert landscape. The listing said the cabin sat near an old trading route, a few miles off a dirt road, surrounded by open land and short pine trees. It looked simple, one room, a porch, a little wood stove. It was the kind of isolation I thought I needed. The first night was peaceful. The air felt dry and cold, the kind that makes your skin tighten. I sat on the porch until the sun sank behind the hills. There was nothing but the faint sound of wind moving through the grass and the clicking of insects. I remember thinking how strange it was to be somewhere that quiet, No phones, no people, no cars. Just space. The cabin was small but sturdy. The wooden floor creaked under my boots. There was a single bed against one wall, a small kitchen counter, and a shelf with some old books. Someone had left a rusted oil lantern and a half-used candle on the table. I unpacked my things, lit the stove, and sat down to eat a sandwich I'd brought from town. The heat from the fire filled the room slowly, mixing with the smell of the dry wood. Around 10, I went outside one last time before sleeping. The stars looked endless, sharper than I'd ever seen. The land stretched out flat, just rolling patches of scrub and low hills. I heard something move in the distance. Maybe a coyote, maybe just wind through dry grass. It was normal, I told myself. Out here, everything had a sound. The next morning, I woke early, made coffee, and walked a few miles east toward the ridge. The ground was dusty, scattered with small bones and animal tracks. I found some prints that looked like deer, then others that didn't make sense. They were narrow and long, almost like human footprints, but with deep heel marks, as if whoever made them had been running on all fours. I crouched down and touched the dirt. The prints looked fresh. By noon, clouds started to move in. I headed back to the cabin as the wind picked up, pushing dust through the air. I spent the afternoon reading and splitting wood. The place had a strange feeling now, not dangerous exactly, but watched. Every so often, I'd glance out the small window, half expecting to see something standing out there in the open. There was never anything. That night, around 9, I heard a sound that made my skin crawl. It wasn't loud, just sharp enough to cut through the wind. It sounded like someone calling out. Not words, just a broken voice, low and uneven. My first thought was that someone had gotten lost. The nearest town was over 30 miles away, but maybe a hunter or a hiker had wandered too far. I stood still for a minute, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, dragging through the air like it hurt to speak. I stepped outside with my flashlight. The wind was cold against my face. I scanned the open land, but there was nothing but darkness. I walked a few yards away from the porch, shining the light across the grass. I saw movement for a second, something crouched low, then gone. My heart jumped. Could have been an animal, maybe a coyote, but the way it moved wasn't right. It was too quick, too smooth. I went back inside and bolted the door. The sound didn't come again for a while. I tried to focus on the fire, the flicker of the flames against the walls. Around midnight, I heard scratching. Slow, steady scratching along the side of the cabin. It moved from one wall to another, like someone running their nails along the wood. I held my breath and waited. The sound stopped. Then came soft steps around the porch, not paws, not hooves. Footsteps. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting in the corner with the fire poker in my hand. When the first light came through the window, I opened the door and looked around. There were marks all over the ground. Prints again, some deep and some shallow. They circled the cabin. A few looked like hands pressed into the dirt. I could see where something had leaned against the wall, leaving long smears of mud. I thought about leaving right then, but I told myself it must have been an animal, maybe a big dog or a mountain lion. Still, there was something human about the way those marks looked. The day passed slow. I barely ate. Every sound outside made me look up. The sky stayed gray, and the air smelled of rain that never came. Toward evening, I walked behind the cabin to check the small shed where firewood was stacked. The door was half open. Inside, the smell hit me, rotten and sharp. There was a dead deer lying against the back wall, its legs twisted, the skin torn in strips. It hadn't been there yesterday. Its ribs were cracked open like something had pulled them apart by hand. I stumbled back and shut the shed door. My stomach turned. I locked myself inside the cabin again, loaded more wood into the stove, and sat with my back to the wall. The firelight flickered on my hands, making them look orange and thin. I could feel the fear in my chest, heavy and steady. After dark, I heard movement again, this time closer, slower. I didn't move, I just listened. I could hear the sound of breathing outside the window, long, uneven breaths. Something brushed against the wall, then the window frame creaked as if weight pressed on it. I turned off the lantern and sat in the dark. The breathing stayed there for what felt like hours. Sometimes it stopped, then started again. I could picture something standing just outside, trying to listen. Around 3 in the morning, it went quiet. I didn't sleep at all.
At sunrise, I packed my bag.
My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to move fast. I opened the door and stepped outside, looking around the clearing. The ground was covered in fresh prints again, but now I could see blood in them, dark and dried. A few strands of hair, not fur but hair, were caught on the porch railing. Brown, tangled like human hair. I got in my truck and started driving before the engine had even warmed up. The dirt road seemed longer than before. Every turn felt like it took me deeper into nowhere. About 3 miles down, I saw something lying near the edge of the road. I slowed down just enough to look. It was the deer from the shed, or what was left of it. His body had been dragged out, twisted again. But what made my stomach drop was the shape crouched beside it. It was a person, or at least it looked like one at first.
Thin, bare, skin stretched tight over bones.
Its limbs were wrong, bent too far, and its head turned sharply as the truck passed. The eyes caught the light for a second, reflecting it like an animal's. Then it moved, crawling fast back into the brush. I didn't stop. I didn't even look in the mirror. I drove until I hit the main road and didn't stop until I reached Flagstaff. Later that day, I told a park ranger I'd seen a strange animal near an old cabin. He said there were reports of people spotting figures like that around reservation land, but no one ever found tracks that made sense. I didn't argue or ask questions. I just wanted to leave it behind. That night, in my hotel room, I scrubbed my hands again and again. There was still dirt under my nails, mixed with tiny splinters of wood from the cabin wall. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shape crouched beside that deer, the way it turned its head like it recognized me. A week later, when I finally looked through the photos I'd taken on that trip, most of them were normal rocks, trees, sky. But in one, taken the first evening from the porch, there was something in the background. Between 2 trees, a tall, thin figure stood just at the edge of the light. I hadn't seen it then. I deleted the picture right after, but it didn't matter. That image stayed in my head. I never went back to Arizona after that. And even now, sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, I still hear that slow, dragging sound against the wall, like nails searching for a way in. It was early October of 2017 when I decided to take a short break from work and spend a few quiet days alone in a small cabin I had rented in northern England, near the edge of Northumberland National Park. The cabin sat on a slope, overlooking a line of thick pine trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the distance. I found it online, cheap, isolated, and simple, just what I wanted. I needed silence for a few days, away from traffic, calls, and people. When I arrived, the air had that damp chill that northern England carries even before winter starts. The cabin was small, 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that smelled faintly of old wood and burnt coffee. The owner had left a small note saying the electricity could go off during storms, and the nearest town was about 20 miles away. I didn't mind. I brought enough supplies, canned food, water, and a small generator I could run if needed. The first 2 nights were peaceful. The weather stayed cloudy, and a fine drizzle fell most of the time. I took long walks along the muddy path leading to an old, unused trail that curved around the hills. I saw no one, not even a farmer or another hiker. The only sounds were the crows and the wind pressing through the trees. At night, I would sit near the window with a small lamp on, listening to the distant rustle of the forest. On the third day, the air changed. The temperature dropped sharply, and a heavy mist rolled in before noon. It was the kind of fog that made the trees look like shadows, bending and stretching in strange shapes. I stayed inside most of the day, reading and keeping the heater on. Around evening, I took my dog, Max, a large black lab, outside for a quick walk before dark. The air was still, heavy, and quiet. Max seemed nervous, sniffing the ground constantly and stopping often. We walked down the path until I saw something through the fog, a faint figure standing near the edge of the woods. It was far away, but clearly a person. I stopped, trying to make out what I was looking at. The figure didn't move, just stood there facing my direction. At first, I thought it might be a local, maybe someone checking their property or just walking, but something about how still they were made my stomach tighten. I turned around and went back to the cabin, trying not to show that I was uneasy. Max kept looking back over his shoulder until we reached the door. That night, I couldn't relax. The fog pressed close against the windows, and every creak in the woods seemed louder. Around midnight, while lying in bed, I heard something faint outside, a slow, scraping sound, like someone dragging a branch across the side of the cabin. I froze. The sound came again, this time closer to the window. I sat up slowly, heart pounding, listening carefully. The sound stopped. I waited for what felt like an hour, but might have only been a few minutes. Then I heard Max growl low from the living room. I grabbed my flashlight, got out of bed, and moved quietly to the window. When I shone the light outside, the beam hit the fog, bouncing back like a white wall. I couldn't see anything. I stayed up the rest of the night, dozing off only after sunrise. The next morning was gray and wet again. I went outside to check around the cabin. Near the back wall, the damp soil showed faint footprints, bare feet, small, maybe a woman's. They led from the forest to the cabin and then disappeared near the side window. The sight of those prints made me feel sick. The ground was cold, the kind of cold that burns skin, and whoever made them wasn't wearing shoes. I thought about packing up and leaving, but the nearest station was hours away, and the road was rough. I told myself it was probably some lost hiker, maybe even a prank. Still, I couldn't shake off the unease. That evening, I tried to distract myself by chopping some wood behind the cabin. As I worked, I kept glancing toward the tree line. The fog was thinner now, but the woods still looked darker than they should have. At one point, I noticed a figure again, standing farther this time, half hidden behind the trees. It was a woman. That much I could tell from her shape, thin, wearing what looked like a long gray coat. She didn't move. I dropped the axe and stared. For a moment I thought maybe I was imagining her, but when I blinked, she was still there. I stepped backward, my throat dry, and then hurried inside, locking the door. I stayed near the window, watching, but when I looked again, she was gone. The night came too slowly. I kept the lights on and sat in the living room with Max beside me. The wind started picking up, rattling the glass panes. Sometime after midnight, I heard a faint knock. Not loud, not quick, just one slow knock on the front door. Max jumped up and barked, his fur standing up along his neck. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The knock came again, slower this time, then nothing. I sat frozen, gripping the flashlight, waiting for another sound. After a long silence, I decided not to check. I stayed where I was until the first light of morning came through the curtains. When I finally gathered enough courage to look outside, there was no one. The ground around the steps was muddy, and I saw the same small bare footprints again. They led from the woods to the door and then back, fading into the trees. I didn't even bother eating breakfast. I packed everything I could fit into the car and started to leave. But as I was loading the trunk, I noticed something that made me stop cold. Behind the cabin, near the edge of the trees, a small piece of gray fabric was caught on a low branch. I went closer and saw it was part of an old coat sleeve, torn, dirty, and stiff from rain. The material looked old, like it had been there for months. I followed the direction the fabric came from, just a few steps into the trees, where the ground dipped slightly. That's when I saw what looked like a shallow trench covered with leaves and branches. I brushed some of them aside, and underneath, I saw part of a shoe and what looked like bone. I froze completely. The smell hit me a second later, sweet, foul, unmistakable. My mind blanked. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, tripping over roots as I ran back to the cabin. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. I jumped into the car and drove until I reached a main road, where I finally called the police. They found the site later that day. What they discovered was an unmarked shallow grave, half exposed from rainfall and animal digging. The remains belonged to a woman who had gone missing almost 3 years before in the area. She had been camping alone, according to the report. The police told me the case was still open. They didn't say much more, only that it looked like she'd been there for a long time. They asked me about the footprints and the coat, but there wasn't much I could tell them. I hadn't seen her face and I hadn't taken any pictures. I left the cabin that day and never went back. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep properly. Every sound at night made me tense up. What disturbed me most wasn't the grave. It was the thought of those footprints. They weren't old. The rain had fallen the night before, and the prints were clear, pressed deep into fresh, wet soil. Sometimes I wonder if someone else was still living out there in those woods, watching, moving quietly through the fog, wearing that same torn coat. Maybe the woman I saw wasn't the one in the ground, but someone else entirely. Someone who didn't want to be found. I don't go near the countryside anymore. Even years later, whenever I see fog rolling in or smell wet pine, I remember that night. The sound of that slow knock still echoes in my head sometimes, reminding me how close she must have been. Just a few inches of wood between us, standing there barefoot in the cold, watching. It was the autumn of 1997, somewhere in the northern woods of Montana. I was 26 at the time, tired of everything. The noise, the crowds, the city. I had quit my job a month earlier and packed my old Ford pickup with tools. An axe, a saw, and a few supplies. I didn't have a plan except one thing. I wanted to build a small cabin somewhere deep in the woods, away from everything and everyone. It wasn't for anyone else to see. It was supposed to be a quiet place for me to think. The first few days out there were calm. I found a spot about a mile off an old dirt road, near a small stream that cut through the trees. The forest around it was thick with spruce and pine, the ground soft with needles and moss. I could hear the water running faintly, and at night the only sounds were the wind brushing through the branches and the faint creak of the trees. It was peaceful, but it carried a kind of silence that made every sound feel sharper. I started clearing the land by hand. Each day I'd wake before dawn, make a small fire, boil some instant coffee, and then swing the axe until my shoulders burned. The first few logs for the cabin came from the trees closest to the stream. I marked them, felled them, stripped the bark, and started stacking. It was slow work, but there was something deeply satisfying about it. Each evening I'd sit on a stump, looking at what I had built, the rough skeleton of a cabin, just big enough for one person. Then came the rain. It started late one afternoon, a thin drizzle that became heavier with each hour. The air turned colder, and by dusk, it was coming down hard. I covered what I could with a plastic tarp, but the ground turned muddy fast. The sound of the rain on the metal roof sheets I had brought echoed through the woods, drowning out everything else. I decided to stay the night under the half-built roof, just to keep things dry. The night was darker than usual. Clouds covered the moon completely, and the rain kept pouring in heavy sheets. I built a small fire under the shelter, just enough to stay warm, but the wood was damp and smoked more than it burned. The smell of wet earth filled the air. Around midnight, I noticed something strange, a faint light moving through the trees. At first, I thought it might be lightning, but it wasn't flashing. It was steady, moving slowly, bobbing like someone carrying a flashlight. I turned off my lantern and crouched near the fire. The rain softened the sound of everything else, so I couldn't tell how close it was, but I knew it wasn't far. There weren't supposed to be any other people this deep in the woods. The nearest town was over 20 miles away. I told myself it could be a hunter or a ranger checking on illegal camps, but even then, nobody would be out in this weather. The light vanished after a while, swallowed by the rain and the dark. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time the wind shifted, I thought I heard something. Branches snapping, soft footsteps in the mud. My dog, a black shepherd mix named Leo, stayed awake too, his ears twitching, nose pointed toward the tree line. He didn't growl, but he stayed alert, and that told me something wasn't right. By morning, the rain hadn't stopped. Everything was soaked. My clothes, my blanket, the ground beneath me. I tried to keep working, but the mud made it impossible to move logs or hammer properly. Around noon, I decided to walk down to the stream to check if it had overflowed. When I reached it, I saw something that made my stomach tighten: boot prints. They weren't mine. They were fresh, pressed deep in the mud, leading from the other side of the stream toward my camp. I followed them for a few feet, but they vanished into the wet ground near the trees. Whoever it was, they had been there sometime during the night, close enough to see my fire. That realization made me uneasy. I packed my things tighter, kept my axe close, and didn't leave the cabin site again that day. The rain kept coming, heavy and constant, and by dusk the forest had turned into a maze of dripping branches and fog. That night was worse than the last. The firewood was soaked, and I couldn't keep the flame alive. The only light came from my small lantern, and even that started to dim after a few hours. I wrapped myself in a tarp and sat in the dark, listening. Around midnight again, I heard it. Faint at first, but clear enough to make my pulse quicken. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, in the mud outside the cabin frame. They stopped for a few seconds, then continued, circling. I could hear the soft squelch of boots in the wet ground. Leo started growling low in his throat. I gripped the axe handle so tight my hand ached. The footsteps stopped behind the half-built wall, just a few feet from me. I didn't move. The rain pounded hard on the roof, masking smaller sounds, but I could feel someone's presence. That strange, heavy quiet when you know you're not alone. Then, after what felt like a full minute, I heard retreating steps, slower this time, fading into the rain. I stayed awake until dawn. When I finally stepped outside, the prints were everywhere. Clear marks in the mud circling my camp, stopping just beside where I had been sleeping. They were from heavy work boots, larger than mine. I counted at least 3 different sets of prints, all leading toward the woods and disappearing into the undergrowth. That was enough for me. I didn't care how much work I had put into that cabin. I packed up everything I could fit into my truck, loaded Leo in the passenger seat, and drove out. The tires spun in the mud a few times, but I didn't stop until I hit the dirt road. Even then, I kept checking the mirrors. I drove for nearly 2 hours before reaching a small gas station on the highway. The rain had eased into a steady drizzle by then. I went inside, soaked to the bone, and bought a coffee. The old man behind the counter glanced at me, probably thinking I was some lost camper, but I didn't say anything. Before leaving, I asked if anyone lived near that forest road. He said no, not for miles. He mentioned there used to be an old logging site out there decades ago, but it had been abandoned since the late 70s. Some people still used it to dump scrap or hide things they didn't want found. That drive home felt endless. The whole time I kept thinking about those boot prints, how many there were, how close they had been, how they vanished without a trace. It wasn't fear exactly, more like the realization that I had stumbled somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. A week later, I went back into the woods during the day just to see if I'd imagined everything. The rain had stopped, and the air was crisp and clean. When I reached the place, the clearing was empty. My half-built cabin still stood there, half collapsed, but something was different. Near where I'd kept my tools, I found an old can of food, rusted and dented, with a knife sticking upright in the ground beside it. It wasn't mine. That was the last time I ever went back. Even now, all these years later, whenever it rains hard at night, I can still hear that sound. The slow, careful footsteps in the mud, circling just outside the walls of a place I never finished. I don't think about who it was anymore. Maybe it was someone living out there, hiding from something or someone. Maybe it was more than one person. I don't know. But I know one thing. I was never alone in those woods. Not for a single night. It was late October 2014 when my boss, Daniel, asked me to join him for a weekend trip to his cabin in northern Montana. He called it a team retreat, though there were no other coworkers going, just me and him. I was 29 at the time, a junior project manager at a construction company, and I didn't want to say no. He was one of those men who never smiled fully, only halfway, and even then it looked more like he was thinking about something else. Still, I figured it'd be good for my career to make a solid impression. The drive up there was long, almost 7 hours north of Missoula. We left the paved roads miles behind, and the last hour was just dirt and gravel winding through thick pine woods. The farther we went, the less cell signal I had. By the time we reached the cabin, my phone was basically useless. The place was small and square, sitting in a clearing surrounded by trees that seemed to lean inward. The roof sagged a bit in the middle, and the porch was covered in pine needles that looked like they'd been piling up for years. A rusty metal chimney poked out of the roof, and a single light bulb hung above the front door. Inside, it was quiet and colder than I expected. The floorboards creaked with every step, and the smell of damp wood and old smoke hung in the air. There were only 2 rooms, the main living space and a smaller back room that had 2 twin beds. The kitchen area was just a counter, a tiny gas stove, and a dented sink. The cabin had no electricity except for a small generator that Daniel said we'd use only at night. He unpacked quickly, setting his bag beside one of the beds. I dropped mine on the other. There was no conversation, no real plan. He wrote something down in a notebook while I wandered around outside. The woods were quiet in that kind of way that makes you feel like you're being watched. The air was sharp, clean, but carried a smell of something distant. Wet soil, decaying leaves, and something metallic, like blood from a cut finger. That first night, the generator hummed faintly while I lay in bed staring at the wooden ceiling. The cabin walls were thin. I could hear Daniel pacing in the other room, his boots creaking against the boards. I thought maybe he was just restless, but the pacing went on for almost an hour. Then silence. I tried to sleep, but every time the wind moved through the trees outside, the sound made the cabin groan, and it felt like the whole place was breathing. In the morning, Daniel was already outside when I woke up. He had an old thermos in one hand and a notepad in the other. He told me to look around the property, which really meant just walking in circles through the same patch of trees, because the woods were so dense it was impossible to see far. I walked until the cabin was out of sight, then turned around to go back, but it took me longer than I expected. When I finally saw the roof again through the trees, it wasn't from the same direction I'd left. That threw me off. By noon, the temperature dropped and clouds rolled in. It started to drizzle. Daniel had stacked some firewood near the porch, so I decided to start the fire before it got dark. The logs were half rotten and damp, so it took a while. He came back just before sunset, carrying a small hunting rifle and a dirty canvas bag. He didn't explain where he'd been. He just set the rifle by the door and went into the back room. That night, the rain turned heavy. The sound of it hitting the roof was constant and rough like static. The wind pushed through the trees, making them bend and creak. Around midnight, the generator sputtered and went out, leaving everything in complete darkness. I stayed in bed, listening to the rain and the sound of Daniel moving around again. Except this time it wasn't pacing, it was slower, heavier. He went outside at some point. I heard the door open, the hinges whining, then footsteps fading into the rain. I didn't hear him come back for a long time. I tried to convince myself he was just checking something, maybe securing the generator. But when I got up in the dark and went to look, the rifle was gone. I stood at the door and listened. Nothing but rain. My flashlight beam caught only trees and mist. He came back near dawn, soaked from head to toe. His clothes were muddy up to his knees. He dropped the rifle against the wall, sat down by the fire pit, and stayed like that for hours, not moving much. I didn't ask what he'd been doing. I didn't want to. Something about him seemed different. Still, focused, like he was waiting for something. Later that day, he asked me to help dig a small pit behind the cabin. He said it was for waste disposal, but the hole was too deep and wide for that. The ground was wet, heavy to dig, and every shovel of dirt made a dull, wet sound. My hands hurt from the work, but he kept going until the hole was nearly 4 feet deep. Then he stopped, told me it was fine, and walked back inside. I stood there for a long time staring at it, wondering why we dug it in the first place. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. The air in the cabin felt thick, heavy, like it was holding its breath. I could hear Daniel breathing in the bed across from mine. Every so often, he'd shift or scratch his arm, but otherwise he was still. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something outside, a faint scraping sound near the porch. It wasn't wind. It was deliberate, slow dragging. I sat up, straining to hear. Then came the faint metallic click like metal tapping wood. The same sound again, closer. Daniel didn't move. Or maybe he was awake, listening too. I waited for him to get up or say something, but he didn't. The noise continued for maybe 10 minutes, then stopped suddenly. I didn't go back to sleep after that. The morning light felt pale and weak. Daniel was gone again. His bed was still unmade, his boots missing. I checked outside, no sign of him. The rifle was gone too. I called his name a few times, but my voice just disappeared into the trees. By late afternoon, I realized something was wrong. I went out to the pit we dug. It was filled in. The dirt was fresh, darker than the rest of the ground. There were marks on the surface like something had been dragged across it. My stomach tightened. I backed away, looking toward the tree line. When Daniel came back at dusk, he was covered in mud again. He looked exhausted but calm. He didn't explain anything, didn't even glance at me. That night, he kept the cabin door bolted shut and stacked the extra wood against it, as if expecting someone or something to come through. The next morning, I woke up to silence. No rain, no wind. The kind of silence that hurts your ears. Daniel's bed was empty again, but this time his bag was gone. I checked outside, and his truck was still there, but the keys weren't. The pit was dug open again. This time it was empty, but the dirt around it was disturbed. I left that day. I didn't even pack everything, just enough to get home. I drove down that endless dirt road, checking the mirror every few minutes, half expecting to see his truck following me. It never did. A week later, when I went back to work, Daniel wasn't there. His office was empty. No one had seen him since the weekend. They said the company assumed he'd taken some kind of leave, but after a month, the police got involved. They found his truck a few miles from the cabin, half buried in mud near a dried-up creek. The pit behind the cabin had been dug up again, but there was nothing in it. Just empty dirt and a faint smell of decay that no one could explain. They never found Daniel. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that cabin, about how still those woods were, how heavy the silence felt. I still see the pit in my head, the wet dirt, the dragging marks, the rain-soaked ground. I never told anyone what I saw or how it felt out there. But every time it rains, I think about that weekend. I think about the sound of footsteps in the dark and how the ground behind that cabin always looked freshly disturbed, like the earth itself was trying to bury something it didn't want found. It was the summer of 1998 when I decided to take a week off from work and drive out to a small cabin I'd rented in northern Montana. I was 32 at the time, working as a mechanic in a small town south of Billings. Life was simple but heavy, and I needed a break from the same daily routine, the same greasy hands, and the same cold mornings inside that dull shop. The cabin was in a remote area near a stretch of old forest that barely saw visitors anymore. I'd found it through a handwritten ad pinned to a notice board at a gas station. Just a brief description, no photos, no website, nothing modern. But it was cheap, and I figured it would give me a few quiet days away from noise and people. The drive up there took nearly 9 hours. The deeper I went into the woods, the narrower the road became until it turned into a dirt path filled with small rocks and potholes. The last few miles were nothing but rough track, overgrown weeds brushing against the sides of my truck. When I finally reached the clearing, I saw the cabin standing alone, small and weathered, with faded green paint and a tin roof that had rust creeping along the edges. A single metal chimney stuck out crookedly. There was a water pump out front and a small shed to the side, probably for storing firewood. The area was quiet in a way that felt heavier than peaceful. The air smelled of pine and damp soil, and I could hear nothing but the occasional creak of trees moving in the wind. Inside, the cabin looked like it hadn't been used in years. The wooden floor had stains that looked like water damage, and some boards were uneven. A small table stood near the window, 2 chairs on either side, and an old iron stove sat against the far wall. There was a single bed in the corner with a thin mattress and a wool blanket that smelled like dust. The windows had no curtains, just warped glass that made the trees outside look slightly bent. Still, I unpacked my things, lit the lantern I'd brought, and told myself I'd get used to the quiet. The first day went fine. I walked around the nearby woods, took a few photos, and chopped some wood for the stove. By evening, I'd made some canned chili and sat outside, watching the light fade between the trees. The sunset was beautiful, deep orange light hitting the trunks, long shadows stretching across the clearing. The forest turned completely dark in less than half an hour. It was strange how fast the night came there. No streetlights, no glow from distant towns, just pitch black. I could hear every sound. The soft crunch of leaves, insects buzzing, the occasional snap of a branch somewhere far off. That night, as I lay on the bed, I realized how loud silence could feel when you're completely alone. I could hear the ticking of my wristwatch on the table beside me, the faint drip of water from somewhere near the sink. Around midnight, I heard something move outside. It wasn't close, just faint rustling in the brush near the treeline. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon, but it kept coming back in small bursts. Rustle, then quiet. A few minutes later, another rustle. Then the sound of something like slow, uneven footsteps in the dry grass. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, my heartbeat louder than anything else. After a while, it stopped, and I managed to fall asleep. The next morning, I found fresh footprints near the pump. Human, definitely not mine. They weren't clear enough to show shoe details, but they were larger than my size and had been made sometime after the rain that fell overnight. They led from the treeline toward the back of the cabin, then turned away again. My stomach felt tight looking at them. There was no reason anyone should be out there. The nearest house was miles away. I didn't find any sign of someone trying to get in, so I tried to brush it off. But the thought followed me the rest of the day. By evening, I noticed more things that felt off. The shed door was open when I was sure I'd closed it. A tin cup I left on the table inside the cabin was now sitting near the sink. I kept trying to reason it out. Maybe I'd just forgotten, but each small thing made me more aware of how alone I was. I decided to stay inside that night and keep the lantern lit. I sat near the stove for hours, listening. Around midnight again, I heard something outside, closer this time. The sound of footsteps crunching slowly through the grass, circling the cabin. Then silence. A few seconds later, a light thud, like someone leaning or pressing against the wall from outside. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe properly. The sound lingered, then faded, replaced by the faint whisper of wind through the cracks of the old wood. I didn't sleep that night. When dawn came, I stepped outside. There were marks on the wall, smudges near the window, as if someone had been touching it with dirty hands. My first thought was to pack up and leave, but the road back down was rough and long, and my truck was low on gas. I had enough for one trip out, so I decided I'd leave the next morning when the sun was high. I spent the day tense and alert, jumping at small sounds, trying to distract myself by chopping more wood. I noticed at one point that a few branches had been freshly cut near the treeline. Clean cuts, almost as if someone had been watching from there and cleared a small view through the brush. That night, I didn't bother trying to sleep on the bed. I sat on the chair with my flashlight, my knife on the table beside me. Hours passed. Then I heard it again, the faint sound of movement in the grass. Slow, careful, the same footsteps circling the cabin. The noise stopped near the door. I could hear a light creak, the soft sound of metal touching metal, like someone testing the handle. My throat went dry. I held the flashlight tight and waited. After what felt like minutes, the sound moved away. I waited another hour before standing up. When the morning came, I walked around the cabin again. More footprints. They were everywhere, around the back, near the windows, near the shed. I checked the shed again and saw something that froze me. A small pile of cigarette butts, still fresh, tucked behind a stack of wood. Someone had been staying there, probably for days. I started packing everything right then. I loaded the truck as fast as I could, not caring about order. Before leaving, I took one last look at the cabin. That's when I saw something near the treeline, just a piece of fabric caught on a branch. It was from a dark jacket, torn at the edge, still damp. Whoever it was, they'd been close, watching, maybe even inside when I'd gone out to the woods earlier. I drove down that road faster than I should have. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and every time I glanced at the mirror, I half expected to see someone following me on foot. When I finally reached the main road and cell service returned, I called the sheriff's office in the nearest town. They sent someone out there later that day. A week after, I got a call back. The deputy said they'd found signs of someone camping near the property. Old food wrappers, footprints, the remains of a small fire pit, but nothing else. Whoever it was had disappeared. I never went back to Montana after that. For a long time, I had trouble sleeping, especially when the wind brushed against my window or when I heard small sounds outside at night. It wasn't the idea of ghosts or anything supernatural that bothered me. It was the thought of that person out there in the dark, silent, patient, and watching. Someone who didn't need a reason. Someone who waited until nightfall to move closer. Sometimes I think about how easy it would have been for things to end differently. if I'd stayed another night, if I hadn't checked the shed, if I'd been too tired to notice the signs. I still don't know who it was or what they wanted, but every once in a while, when I drive past a patch of woods, I can almost feel that same quiet weight, the feeling of being watched from somewhere just beyond the trees, where the light doesn't reach and where silence feels alive. It was October of 2016, somewhere in the northern woods of Montana. I was 32 back then, and I had taken a week off work to go hunting alone. I had done this a few times before, though never this deep into the wilderness. I had found an old hunting cabin through a friend of a friend, said it was isolated but still sturdy enough to stay in. When I drove up the dirt road that led to it, the forest swallowed my truck completely. The trees grew so thick and tall that the light barely touched the ground. The air smelled of pine and cold soil, and every sound, branches breaking, wind brushing through the trees, felt sharper, heavier. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin sat, it was smaller than I expected. The wood on the walls was grayed from age, and moss had started to creep up along the sides. The roof sagged a little in the middle, but it looked like it would hold. There was a shed behind it, half collapsed and overgrown. The nearest sign of a road or another person was miles away. That isolation was part of what I wanted. No noise, no people, just me, the woods, and the quiet. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and old wood. The floor creaked with every step, and the windows were cloudy from years of grime. There was a single cot in the corner, a wood stove, and a small table with 2 chairs. A few old hunting magazines were scattered on the floor, pages curled and yellow. I unpacked my gear, checked my rifle, and set up a small camp inside. I remember the feeling of calm that night, the kind you only get when you're far from everything, the kind that makes you forget what time feels like. The first few days were quiet. I woke up before dawn, followed deer trails through the trees, and came back after dark. I didn't see much besides a few tracks and some elk droppings. The woods were so still that even small sounds stood out. The snapping of twigs, the flutter of wings, the distant rush of a stream. On the 3rd night, something changed. I had been sitting near the stove, writing notes in a small journal about what I'd seen that day. It must have been close to midnight when I heard something out back. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. A slow, dragging noise, like something being pulled through the dirt. I froze for a few seconds, listening. The wind was still, and there were no animal calls, just that dragging sound. Then it stopped. I went to the window, but the glass was too foggy to see through. I remember standing there, my heart beating a little faster than normal, waiting for it again. After a few minutes, it was quiet. I told myself it was probably a branch shifting or maybe a deer brushing against the shed. Still, I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I went out back. The ground was damp from the cold air, and I saw marks in the dirt leading from the tree line to the shed. Long, shallow lines like something heavy had been dragged. No boat prints, no paw prints. Just those lines. The shed door was barely hanging by one hinge. I pushed it open, and the smell hit me first. A strong, sour stench of something rotten. Inside, there were old hunting tools, a few rusted traps, and broken boards. In the corner was a pile of old burlap sacks. One of them looked newer, not by much, but it didn't match the rest. I pulled it open, thinking it might be old animal feed or something. But inside, there were bones. Small ones, mostly. Some looked like deer bones, but others didn't. I couldn't tell for sure. The smell was thick enough to make me gag, and I backed out fast, closing the door behind me. I didn't stay there long. I grabbed my rifle, just to be sure, and went out hunting again, trying to push that image out of my head. That night, I locked the door and kept my gun close. The forest outside felt heavier than before, quieter in a way that didn't feel natural. Around 1 in the morning, I woke up to another sound, this time on the porch. Slow, deliberate steps, one after another. I could hear the old wood groaning under the weight. I didn't move. I just lay there, holding my breath, staring at the door. The steps stopped right outside. Then there was silence. Not even the crickets. I must have stayed frozen like that for 10 minutes. Then, out of nowhere, the doorknob turned. It was slow, metal scraping against metal. My heart slammed in my chest so hard it hurt. I aimed the rifle at the door, ready for whatever came next. But the door didn't open. The handle stopped moving. Then I heard soft breathing. Not mine. Deep, slow breaths just on the other side of the wood. I didn't move a muscle. After a while, the sound faded, followed by the creak of the porch boards again. The steps moved away until I couldn't hear them anymore. At sunrise, I went outside. The ground around the porch was disturbed. Muddy prints, but not clean enough to tell what made them. They weren't boots, though. They looked wide, bare, maybe human but rougher. The dirt trailed off into the woods. I followed for a bit, but turned back once I realized how far it led. I packed my things that morning. I wasn't about to stay another night out there. I loaded my gear into the truck, but when I turned the key, nothing happened. The battery was dead. I checked everything, cables, terminals, it was all fine, but the engine wouldn't even click. I didn't have cell service, so I had two choices: wait and hope someone came by, or walk out. It was almost 15 miles to the main road, maybe more, but I didn't want to spend another night there. I packed light and started walking before noon. The forest was different that day. It wasn't just quiet, it felt like it was watching. Every few minutes I'd stop because I thought I heard something behind me, but when I turned, it was just trees and brush. After about an hour, I started noticing small things. Twigs breaking too close behind me. A soft, steady rustle that stopped when I stopped. Once, I saw movement to my right, just a flash of something pale behind the trees. By late afternoon, I reached an old logging road. My legs were aching and I was running out of water. That's when I found something that made my stomach twist. A jacket lying in the dirt. It was torn and sun-faded, but it looked recent, not like something that had been there for years. I didn't touch it. I just kept walking. When I finally reached the main road around sunset, I saw an old pickup parked a few hundred feet away. The driver was a local rancher who'd been heading home. He gave me a ride into town. When we passed the turnoff road that led to the cabin, I told him where I'd been. His expression changed slightly, but he didn't say anything. Just kept driving, his hands tight on the wheel. Later that night, after I got a motel room, I called a tow service to go retrieve my truck the next morning. But when the driver came back, he said there was nothing there. The clearing was empty.
No traque, no cabin, no shed.
Just trees and uneven ground, like nothing had ever been built there. I didn't go back. Not then, not ever. I checked the maps again and again after that, trying to find the same trail or the same clearing, but I never could. Sometimes, when I think back on it, I wonder if I just got turned around, if maybe I ended up somewhere else entirely. But I can still remember the smell of that cabin, the creak of the floor, and that slow sound of breathing on the other side of the door. It's been almost 10 years now. Every fall, when the air turns cold and the woods start to quiet down, I think about that place. I don't hunt anymore. I can't even walk into the woods without feeling that same pressure on my chest, like something's waiting just out of sight. Whatever was out there in those Montana woods, it wasn't a ghost, and it wasn't my imagination. It was real, and I know I was lucky to get out when I did. It was the summer of 2012 when I decided to spend a few weeks alone at my uncle's old farm in southern Illinois. He'd passed away a few months earlier, and the place had been sitting empty since then. My mother wanted someone to go check on it before it was sold off, and since I wasn't doing much with my life at the time, just drifting between part-time jobs, I offered to go. The farm sat on about 50 acres of land, surrounded by open fields and patches of forest that looked almost black when the sun went down. The cabin, if you could even call it that, was a small wooden house at the far end of the property, built sometime in the 1940s. The road leading there was little more than a dirt path with weeds growing through the tire tracks. I remember how the dry grass hissed against the bottom of my car as I drove through it. The cabin looked worse than I remembered. The paint was chipped, the windows clouded with dust, and the porch sagged slightly in the middle. It was late afternoon when I arrived, and the air smelled like old wood, soil, and rust. I parked near the barn, which leaned to one side like it was trying not to fall over. Inside the cabin, the air was thick and stale. I opened all the windows to let it breathe a bit, then started unpacking the few things I'd brought. A sleeping bag, a flashlight, a few cans of food, a folding knife, and a small radio. The electricity still worked, though the lights flickered every now and then. I found a few of my uncle's things still scattered around. An old coat hanging by the door, a coffee mug with a crack down the side, and a calendar from 2009 still nailed to the wall. It felt strange being in that place, like stepping into someone's life that had just suddenly stopped. The first day was quiet. I spent it cleaning, walking around the property, and checking the barn. The inside was full of dust and old farm tools, rusted shovels, ropes, and some animal cages stacked against the wall. There were no animals anymore, but I found old feed bags split open on the ground, the grain scattered and eaten away by mice. When the sun went down, the silence became almost unbearable. Out there, away from town, there was no distant hum of cars or people, just the sound of crickets and the occasional creak of the cabin walls settling. That night, I barely slept. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like footsteps outside the cabin. They were slow and uneven, moving from one side of the porch to the other. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal, a raccoon or a stray dog, but the steps were too heavy for that. I held still in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling. The footsteps stopped after a few minutes, and I told myself it was just my imagination, stirred up by the isolation and the dark. The next morning, I went outside to check. The ground was dry, covered in a thin layer of dust, but near the porch, I saw faint impressions. They weren't clear footprints, more like the disturbed marks of someone walking carefully, heel first. I tried to reason it out. Maybe some local had come by to look at the place, but something about how deliberate the tracks looked unsettled me. I tried to distract myself with work. I started clearing the weeds near the barn and fixed the door hinges that had rusted stiff. The sun was bright and hot that day, and by noon, sweat was dripping down my back. The land stretched out endlessly, the fields golden and still. From the far edge of the property, near a line of trees, I thought I saw movement, a shape standing just where the shadow started. I squinted, but it was gone the second I looked straight at it. Maybe it was a deer. I wanted to believe that. That night, the footsteps came back. I kept the light off and listened. They were slower this time, closer, like someone testing the boards of the porch. Then I heard a scrape, as if something metal had dragged lightly against the wooden railing. My chest felt tight. I wanted to go to the window and look, but every part of me resisted the idea. Instead, I sat there in the dark, gripping the knife I'd left by my bed. After a long while, it went quiet again. In the morning, I noticed that the back door, the one leading to the small field behind the cabin, was slightly open. I was certain I'd locked it the night before. Inside the doorway, there was a muddy mark, a boot print partly smeared. I walked around the cabin, checking every corner, but nothing else seemed touched. Whoever had been there hadn't taken anything. They just entered and left. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I told myself I was being paranoid. It was probably some trespasser who didn't realize anyone was staying there. Still, I started locking the doors earlier, shutting all the windows tight before dusk. On the fourth night, I barely made it through. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a sound inside the cabin. Not outside, inside. Something had creaked near the kitchen. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. I reached for the flashlight and slowly aimed it toward the doorway. The beam shook in my hand. The kitchen was empty, but one of the chairs had been moved. Just slightly, but enough for me to notice. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting against the wall with the light pointed at the door. When dawn came, I walked the property again, scanning for anything. Broken locks, new tracks, anything that could make sense of what was happening. Behind the barn, I found something that stopped me cold. There was an old storage pit there, covered with a wooden lid. The lid had been moved. Inside the pit, half buried in dirt and straw, were a few items I hadn't seen before. A torn piece of flannel, a pair of work gloves, and an old flashlight that still had a bit of dried mud on it. That afternoon, I drove into the nearest town and asked around casually at a diner. I didn't mention the cabin, just said I was staying near the old Miller farm. The waitress told me that a few years ago, there'd been a man who squatted in those parts, moving from one abandoned property to another. He'd broken into people's barns, stolen food, sometimes even lived in their attics without them knowing. The police had looked for him for months, but he'd vanished. When I drove back to the cabin, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe he hadn't gone far at all. Maybe he'd just found new places to hide. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat near the window with my flashlight off, watching the fields. The moonlight was bright enough to see the edges of the trees and the old fence line. Around 3 a.m., I saw movement again. Someone walking slowly near the barn. This time, I didn't hesitate. I turned on the light and aimed it through the glass. The beam caught a glimpse of something pale, a man's face, for only a second, before he turned and ran toward the fields. I ran out after him, the flashlight bouncing in my hand. I could hear him crashing through the dry weeds, moving fast. I followed until the sound faded into the woods, but I never saw where he went. When I came back, the cabin door was wide open. I realized then that chasing him had been a mistake. I'd left the cabin unguarded. Inside, everything looked the same except for one thing. The sleeping bag had been unrolled and dragged toward the kitchen, as if someone had been looking under it. That was enough. I packed my things before sunrise, locked the cabin, and drove out without looking back. A few weeks later, when I told my mother what had happened, she said she'd heard from a neighbor that someone had been arrested near the highway. An older man found sleeping inside an abandoned truck, filthy and half-starved. They said he'd been living off whatever he could find in old farmhouses. I never went back to the cabin after that. The farm was sold later that year, and the new owners tore the place down. But sometimes, when I think about those nights, I wonder how long he'd been there before I showed up. Maybe he'd been watching from the woods, waiting for the right time. Maybe the noises I'd heard weren't him arriving, but him already being there, trying to make sure I didn't find out too soon. Even now, when I stay somewhere alone, I still check the corners of every room before I sleep. Not because I'm afraid of ghosts or anything like that, but because I know that sometimes the scariest thing hiding in the dark is just another person. It was late September 2012 when I decided to drive out toward the western edge of Maine, close to the border where the woods grow thicker than most people ever see. I had been working long shifts at the warehouse for months and needed a break from the noise. So I rented a small cabin listed online by some old man who never answered his phone but left an address and a key under a rock. The ad said it was once his grandfather's hunting cabin, tucked deep in the woods, with no neighbors for miles. I thought it sounded peaceful. The drive took almost 5 hours from where I lived in Portland. The farther I went, the thinner the roads became. Asphalt turned to cracked gravel, and by the time I hit the last stretch, my car shook so much I had to drive barely 15 miles an hour. There weren't any signs anymore, just trees. Endless pine trees closing in from both sides, and a pale gray sky that made everything feel colder than it was. When I finally reached the turn marked by a leaning wooden post, I saw what must have been the old access trail. The cabin was supposed to be down there, a mile off the main path. I parked my car at the edge of the dirt track because I didn't trust the tires on that uneven road. The air smelled like damp bark and old moss. I grabbed my bag and flashlight, even though it was only around 5 p.m. The woods felt darker than they should have at that hour. The trail was narrow, the kind that looks like it hasn't been used in years. Roots broke through the dirt, and fallen branches made it hard to walk in a straight line. After about 20 minutes, I saw the cabin. It stood alone in a small clearing, its roof sagging slightly in the middle, one shutter hanging by a single rusted hinge. The wood was weathered gray, and the front steps looked like they could snap under my weight. There was a tin chimney, bent near the top, and beside the cabin sat a half-collapsed shed filled with what looked like rusted tools and broken buckets. The place looked like nobody had been there for decades. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and a smell hit me immediately. A mix of mildew, old wood, and something faintly sour, like damp cloth that had never dried. Inside, the cabin had one main room with a small stove, a cot, a table, and 2 chairs. A single window faced the clearing. Everything was covered in a thin film of dust, but it didn't look vandalized, just forgotten. I walked around, brushing cobwebs from corners and setting my bag on the table. The silence inside felt heavy. The woods outside didn't make much noise either, just the occasional crack of a branch or a distant bird. I lit the lantern I brought and set it near the window. It gave off a weak yellow glow, barely enough to push the shadows back. The first night went quietly, though I couldn't sleep much. The cot creaked every time I shifted, and the woods outside felt alive in a way that wasn't comforting. Around midnight, I heard a dull thump outside, like something hitting the ground. I lay still, waiting for another sound, but after a few seconds, it was silent again. I told myself it was a branch or maybe an animal knocking something over. The next morning, I found footprints in the mud behind the cabin. They weren't mine. I had worn heavy boots, and these looked smaller, like someone barefoot had walked through. The ground was soft, and the prints were clear, leading from the side of the cabin toward the woods. I stood there staring at them for a while, feeling that strange pull in my chest that happens when your instincts start warning you before your mind catches up. Still, I convinced myself they might be old, maybe from someone who'd been here long ago, before it rained. I spent most of that day exploring around the property. About 30 yards from the cabin, I found a rusted metal barrel half buried in the dirt. Inside were scraps of what looked like old clothing, mostly shredded and blackened as if someone had burned them halfway and stopped. There was also a small animal skull at the bottom. I didn't touch it. I don't know why, but something about that barrel felt off. By the second night, the woods grew colder. I built a fire in the stove, but it barely warmed the place. Around 11 p.m., I started hearing what sounded like faint scraping near the side of the cabin. It wasn't steady, more like someone dragging something slowly against the wood, then stopping, then starting again. I turned off the lantern and listened, my heart pounding. The noise moved along the wall, paused, then shifted to the back of the cabin. I waited until it went quiet, then forced myself to look outside through the window. I couldn't see much, just the outline of trees and my reflection in the glass. But when my eyes adjusted, I thought I saw something just at the edge of the clearing. A shape crouched low to the ground. I blinked, and it was gone. I stood there for a full minute, frozen, before backing away from the window. The next morning, I checked around the cabin again. The ground was disturbed, and there were fresh footprints this time, heading away into the trees. They were still barefoot, smaller than mine, but deep enough to know someone had been close during the night. I packed my things that afternoon. I wanted to leave, but my phone had no signal, and the car was still a 20-minute walk away. I decided to stay one more night and leave first thing at dawn. I stacked some wood by the door, made sure my flashlight had batteries, and kept my knife close just in case. That night, I barely moved from the chair by the stove. Around midnight, I heard footsteps again. Slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. The floor creaked under me as I leaned forward. I could hear breathing outside, faint but close, right against the wall. Then, for a brief second, something brushed against the window. The glass rattled softly. I turned my flashlight on and pointed it toward the window, but whatever it was had already stepped back. I stayed awake until morning. As soon as the sky lightened, I threw my things into my bag and went out the door. The woods were quiet again, but I didn't take my time looking around. When I got back to where I parked the car, the first thing I saw was that my trunk was open. I hadn't left it that way. Inside, the things I packed, food, some clothes, my blanket, were scattered across the ground. There were small muddy handprints on the inside of the trunk lid, like someone had rummaged through everything with wet hands. I didn't stop to clean it up. I threw what was left inside, slammed the lid, and got in the car. The drive back felt longer than the way there. I kept checking the rearview mirror even though I knew there was no one behind me. When I reached a gas station about 30 miles out, I stopped to get a drink and calm down. While I was there, an older man who worked behind the counter saw the dirt on my clothes and asked if I'd been camping. I told him I stayed in an old cabin down near Milford Creek, the one off the side road past the quarry. His face changed slightly, though he didn't say anything at first. Then he told me there used to be an old cabin down there, but it had burned half down years ago after a hunter went missing in those woods. Nobody ever rebuilt it. I didn't say anything else. I just nodded, paid for my drink, and got back in the car. On the way home, I couldn't shake what he said. I had slept in that place. There were still walls, a roof, furniture, everything. Maybe he was wrong, or maybe there were two cabins. But the smell of burnt cloth and that rusted barrel came back to my mind. I never went back to check. I deleted the listing, threw away the lantern, and avoided the woods completely after that. But sometimes, even now, when I park my car and step out on damp soil, I think about those footprints in the mud, bare feet pressing into soft ground, moving silently around a cabin that shouldn't have still been standing. It was late October of 2018 when I took a short-term caretaker job in northern Maine. I was 34 at the time, between jobs and running low on savings. A man named Carl, who handled maintenance for the local township, told me about a small cabin near an old graveyard that needed some work done before winter. The deal was simple: stay there for a week, fix up a few things, and I'd get paid cash. I didn't think much of it. The place was only a few miles from the nearest small town, and I figured it would be quiet and easy work. The drive there was slow and rough. The road narrowed into a single lane of cracked asphalt surrounded by tall, leafless trees. When I finally reached the cabin, it sat alone on a small slope beside a rusted iron fence that ran along the edge of the graveyard. The cemetery wasn't big, maybe 50 or 60 old stone markers, most of them leaning to one side or broken. The names were worn smooth by time. The place looked forgotten. The cabin itself was old, but solid. It had gray wooden walls, a tin roof, and a stone chimney that leaned slightly to one side. The air smelled like wet dirt and pine needles. The porch steps creaked under my boots when I carried my things inside. There wasn't much in the cabin, just a small table, a couple of wooden chairs, a cot, and a fireplace. The windows were streaked with grime and the floorboards felt uneven in some places. The first night was quiet. I made a fire, cooked a can of beans, and listened to the wind through the trees. The graveyard didn't bother me at first. I had no reason to be scared of it. I told myself it was just part of the land. Still, every time I glanced through the window, the sight of those dark stones sitting in the mist made me uneasy. The next morning, I started fixing things around the cabin. The front door wouldn't close properly, and one of the window frames had come loose. While working outside, I noticed how soft the ground felt near the fence, almost spongy. The soil looked darker there, like it had been turned over recently. I didn't think too hard about it at first. Maybe some animal had been digging. Around noon, I walked through the graveyard just to look around. Most of the stones were from the late 1800s. A few were newer, but still old enough that no one had visited in years. The iron gate had fallen off its hinges, and dry leaves were piled against the base of a large marble cross. Near the back corner, I saw a newer patch of dirt, like a grave that hadn't fully settled. No headstone, just a mound. It didn't look official. That night, the air turned colder. The fire kept the cabin warm, but every sound outside carried clearly. Branches snapping, the wind brushing against the roof, the slow rustle of leaves. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. There was a faint scraping sound outside, slow and steady, like something dragging across the ground. I lay still, listening. It went on for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. The next morning, I went outside to look. The ground was damp from the night fog, and near the graveyard fence, I found what looked like a long mark in the dirt, running parallel to the fence line. It was too straight to be an animal. I followed it with my eyes. It went right up to that newer mound of dirt at the back of the cemetery. I felt uneasy, but told myself maybe the soil had shifted. Still, something about it looked wrong. Later that day, I was cleaning out the fireplace when I found an old photograph tucked behind one of the loose stones. It showed a man standing beside the same cabin, only it looked much newer in the picture. There was a date on the back, 1976. I wondered who he was. Probably a previous caretaker or someone who owned the property long ago. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing small noises, soft thumps, something brushing the side of the cabin. Around 3 in the morning, I heard what sounded like footsteps in the gravel outside, slow and uneven. The sound moved past the window, then faded. I wanted to believe it was an animal, maybe a deer, but something about the rhythm didn't match. By the 4th day, I was exhausted. I tried to distract myself with work. I replaced some boards on the porch, fixed the hinges, and gathered wood for the stove. In the afternoon, while cutting wood, I noticed the smell. Faint but sharp, like rotting meat. It was coming from the far corner of the graveyard, near that fresh mound. I forced myself not to look too closely. When the sun went down, the smell seemed stronger. I ate what little food I had left and decided I'd leave early the next morning. The pay wasn't worth the unease I felt. I packed some of my tools and sat by the window for a while. The graveyard looked even darker than usual. There was no moon that night, just thick cloud cover. Around midnight, I heard it again. That same dragging sound, this time closer. I sat up, staring at the window, trying to make sense of it. The noise stopped. Then I heard a faint thud against the porch. My hands were sweating. The fire had burned down to embers, and I could barely see. I waited, listening. A few minutes later, I heard another sound. A low creak from the porch floorboard, the same one that always groaned when I stepped on it. I stayed still, barely breathing. The noise stopped again. After what felt like hours, I grabbed the small flashlight from my bag and turned it on. The beam was weak, but I aimed it toward the window. Through the dirty glass, I saw the faint outline of something near the edge of the porch. Not moving, just there. I couldn't tell what it was. I stared until my eyes hurt. When I finally blinked, the shape was gone. The next morning, I went outside as soon as it was light. The air was damp and cold. There were clear footprints in the soft dirt near the porch, boot prints, not animal tracks. They led from the graveyard to the cabin steps and then back again. The size was close to mine, maybe a little larger. I felt my stomach tighten. Someone had been out there in the night. I followed the tracks through the fence, across the graveyard, and to that same mound of dirt. The footprints stopped right at the edge of it. I knelt down and touched the soil. It was soft and wet, freshly disturbed again. I stepped back, realizing it wasn't just an old patch of ground. Someone had been digging there. That was enough for me. I packed my things, locked up the cabin, and drove out without looking back. When I reached town, I went straight to the small sheriff's office. I told them about the graveyard, the tracks, the smell, everything. 2 deputies went out to check it. They called me the next afternoon. What they found made my skin crawl. The graveyard wasn't supposed to have any new burials in it. The land had been closed for decades, but at that mound, they found a shallow hole barely 3 feet deep, with pieces of tarp and a pair of old work gloves beside it. There was no body, no coffin, just signs that someone had been digging there recently and then stopped. The sheriff told me the cabin had been used years ago by a man who worked as a gravedigger for the county, back when that cemetery was still active. The man disappeared in the late 1980s, never found. Locals said he used to stay there for weeks at a time, even after he stopped working for the county. Nobody ever knew why. I never went back to that cabin. Sometimes, though, I still think about those footprints, how fresh they looked that morning, how they led straight from that disturbed grave to the steps of the cabin. Whoever had been there that night wasn't buried yet. And the worst part is knowing that I probably wasn't the first person to hear them moving around out there in the dark, between the cabin and the graves. That job was the last time I ever worked alone in a place like that. Even now, years later, when I drive through quiet towns and see old graveyards by the road, I can't help but look away. The silence around them feels too familiar, like that same quiet I heard outside that cabin, right before the sound of footsteps began. It was the summer of 2007 when I started working as a seasonal park ranger at Ridgeview National Park, a massive stretch of pine forest in northern Montana. I was 28 then, trying to pull my life back together after a bad breakup and too many wasted years drifting between jobs. The ranger position was supposed to be a fresh start. A few months of quiet, away from people, surrounded by nothing but trees, dirt trails, and the sounds of nature. They stationed me at an old cabin that sat deep in the northern boundary of the park, about 8 miles from the main ranger station. It wasn't much, just a small wooden structure with 2 rooms, a stove, a metal-framed bed, and a radio that sometimes worked when the signal decided to cooperate. The place had been used for decades, long before any of us current rangers were born. The logs were darkened from age, the floor creaked with every step, and when it rained, water slipped through thin cracks in the roof. But it was quiet, and that was all I wanted. During the first few weeks, I got used to the silence. The only sounds were the rustle of wind through the pine branches and the distant calls of animals. Coyotes, owls, the occasional elk. Every morning, I checked the trail markers, logged the weather, and made sure the fire towers were stocked. My radio contact was limited to 1 check-in every evening before dark. There was no cell service, no visitors that far up, and only 1 dirt road that connected my post to the main station. It was on the 3rd week when something started to feel off. Nothing supernatural or dramatic, just small things that didn't make sense. One morning, I found muddy boot prints outside the cabin door. They weren't mine. The tread was different, smaller, like someone wearing a different brand of hiking boot. At first, I thought maybe one of the other rangers had stopped by early, but there was no reason for them to hike that far just to check in on me. I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was from my first day when I unloaded supplies. But the next morning, the prints were back. Fresher this time, leading from the tree line to the edge of the porch. I started noticing other things too. My food containers inside the storage cabinet had been moved. My flashlight, which I always kept on the shelf beside my bed, was lying on the floor one night when I woke up. The radio sometimes crackled faintly, not with voices, but with static and soft popping sounds that seemed to rise and fade without reason. I kept telling myself it was just me being paranoid. I wasn't used to being alone for so long, and isolation can play tricks on your mind. But then, one night, something happened that I couldn't ignore. It was around midnight. A light drizzle had been falling for hours, and the wind outside was carrying that low, hollow hum it makes when it moves through thick trees. I was lying in bed, half awake, when I heard a noise from outside. It wasn't an animal, no crunching leaves or snapping twigs. It was softer, a steady scrape, like something brushing against the cabin wall. I stayed still, listening. It went on for almost a minute, slow and deliberate, moving from one corner of the cabin to the other. Then it stopped. I sat up and waited, staring at the thin strip of light coming through the curtain. The forest was completely dark. No moon, just the sound of rain on the roof. I told myself it was probably a branch rubbing against the siding, so I forced myself to lie back down. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I went outside to check. The wall near the back of the cabin had long, uneven scratches along it, too high for an animal. The wood was raw and fresh, like something sharp had scraped along it. I checked the ground. There were faint boot prints again, leading away toward the trees. I followed them for maybe 50 feet before they vanished into a patch of mud near the creek. The water had washed away anything else that might have been there. I tried to radio the station to report it, but the signal was dead that morning. I fiddled with it for 20 minutes, getting nothing but static. Over the next few days, I started keeping the cabin locked even when I was inside. I stacked wood against the door at night so I'd hear if anyone tried to open it. I also began noticing small piles of stones near the trail leading up to the cabin. Each pile had the same shape, 3 small rocks balanced carefully on one larger one. It wasn't natural. Someone had placed them there. By the end of that week, I hadn't slept properly in days. Every night, I'd hear something faint outside. The sound of movement, soft footsteps, sometimes a tap against the window. But whenever I looked out, there was nothing. No flashlight beam, no person, no animal. Just the dark. The forest that I had once thought was peaceful began to feel alive in a different way. Every sound felt personal, like it was meant for me. Every shadow between the trees looked like it was watching. Then one evening, just before sunset, I went down to check the small tool shed behind the cabin. The shed was where we kept spare gas cans, old traps, and basic maintenance gear. The door was slightly open. I hadn't been inside it for days. When I pushed it open, the smell hit me, sour, like something had been rotting. Inside, in the far corner, was a pile of animal bones. Small ones, probably rabbits, maybe a raccoon. But they weren't scattered like an animal kill. They were arranged neatly in a small circle on the dirt floor. Right in the middle was my missing canteen, the one I had lost 2 weeks before. It was dented and dirty, lying open with the lid beside it. I remember standing there for a long time, staring at it, trying to come up with any explanation that made sense. Maybe a poacher was using the area, maybe a local hunter with strange habits. But whoever it was, they knew exactly where I was staying. They had been close enough to take things from inside the cabin. That night, I packed everything I could into my backpack: food, flashlight, knife, water, and decided I would hike back to the main station first thing in the morning. I stayed awake all night, sitting near the door with the lantern on. The rain came back hard, slapping against the windows. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, steady, moving through the mud outside. They stopped right outside the door. I didn't move. The sound stayed there for maybe 30 seconds. Then I heard a soft thump, like someone had pressed their hand or face against the wall. Then nothing. The silence after that felt heavier than any sound. I sat there until dawn, staring at the door, my heart pounding the entire time. When morning came, I stepped outside carefully. The ground was soaked, the trees dripping from the rain. There were fresh footprints in the mud. They led around the cabin to the side window and then back into the forest. I followed them as far as I could until the path split into two directions. One led north, deeper into the woods, the other toward the ridge trail that went back to the station. I didn't think twice. I took the ridge trail. It took me nearly 5 hours to reach the main ranger post. My uniform was soaked through, and I could barely feel my hands by the time I got there. I reported everything, every detail. The prints, the scratches, the bones, the noises at night. The senior ranger, a man named Harris, took notes and said they'd send a team out to check the cabin. A week later, they did. When the report came back, it said they found the scratches and the footprints, but nothing else. No bones in the shed, no arranged rocks, no signs of anyone living nearby. They assumed it might have been some drifter or hunter passing through. But that wasn't what stayed with me. What stuck was what one of the younger rangers told me later, quietly, when the others weren't around. He said the tracks they found outside the cabin didn't just lead into the woods. They circled the cabin more than once, like whoever had been there had been walking around it for a long time. Watching, waiting. I quit the job a few weeks after that. I told them I needed to move back home, closer to family. I haven't been back to Montana since. Sometimes at night, when the wind gets that same low hum, I still think about that cabin. About the quiet sound of footsteps outside the walls. About how the forest can hold on to things. People, secrets, memories, and never let them go. And I think about those footprints circling my cabin in the dark. How long had they been there before I noticed? How long had I been watched before I even realized I wasn't alone? It had been almost 5 years since I last saw my ex-husband's cabin. It sat deep in the northern woods of Montana, near a lake that never really looked alive. I hadn't planned to ever go back there. When we separated, I told myself I'd leave everything behind. Him, that place, the memories. But sometimes, life has a strange way of pulling you back to the things you try hardest to escape. It was early November, and I was driving through the back roads, trying to make it to Missoula before dark. The sky was already turning that dull gray that usually means snow is coming, and the air had that sharp, metallic coldness that clings to your face when you breathe. I hadn't thought about that cabin in years, but when I saw the old sign for the turnoff, a bent piece of wood with faded paint, I slowed down. I didn't mean to stop, but I did. Something about seeing that road again pulled at me. It was the same narrow dirt road that wound through the trees, the same one we used to take every fall when the leaves were orange and thick on the ground. The road looked rougher now, more overgrown, like no one had driven down it in a long time. Branches reached over from both sides, brushing against the windshield. I drove slower, the tires crunching over dead leaves and small stones. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to see, but I knew I needed to see it one last time. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't scared of that place anymore. When the trees finally thinned and the clearing opened up, I saw it. The cabin still stood there, small and gray, with the same slanted roof and the same porch where we used to sit drinking coffee in the mornings. But it looked smaller now, like time had drained it of all its weight. The wood was weathered, cracked, almost black in some spots from rot. One of the windows was broken, and the door hung slightly open. I parked the car at the edge of the clearing and stepped out. The air was colder than before, quiet in a way that made my ears ring. I could hear the faint creaking of trees shifting in the wind, the dry rustle of leaves. The place smelled the same: pine, damp wood, and something else faint, like rust or old smoke. I walked toward the cabin slowly. Each step on the porch made a hollow sound under my boots. The boards flexed slightly, but they didn't break. I pushed the door open with my hand and looked inside. Dust floated in the air, thick and lazy, turning in the weak light that came through the broken window. The smell inside was heavier, almost sour. The furniture was still there. The same small table near the kitchen corner, the same couch against the wall. Everything was coated in a thin layer of dust and dirt. The curtains were gone, probably torn down by the wind. The old stove we used to cook on had rust crawling up its sides. On the counter, there was still a cracked coffee mug with a ring of dried brown at the bottom. It was strange. Everything was almost exactly how we'd left it, except quieter. I ran my hand across the table and felt the fine grit stick to my fingers. There were still faint scratches on the surface where he used to work with his knife, carving small lines when he was thinking. It brought back a memory of long nights when we'd stay there during hunting season, when the snow came early and we had to keep the fire burning all night. Those nights were silent too, but never like this. I went to the back room. That was where we used to sleep. The bed frame was still there, but the mattress was torn open, the stuffing spilling out. There were old clothes on the floor, some of his, some of mine. It looked like animals had been through there, maybe raccoons or mice. The window in that room was cracked, and the cold air slid through it like a thin breath. I stood there for a long time, just listening. The sound of the trees outside felt distant, muffled. I could feel the hairs on my arms lift, not because of fear exactly, but because the place felt wrong. Not haunted, just heavy. Like everything that happened there still lingered in the air somehow. I left the room and went back toward the main area. That's when I noticed something near the door. Muddy footprints. They weren't mine. They were older, dry, but definitely human. They came in from the doorway and led toward the corner near the couch. I followed them with my eyes, and I saw something else. A sleeping bag, half unzipped, lying on the floor. Beside it, an empty can of beans, a plastic water bottle, and a small black flashlight. Someone had been living there. I crouched down and touched the sleeping bag. It was cold, stiff, but it didn't look like it had been there for years. Maybe weeks, maybe less. My chest tightened a little. I looked around again, this time slower. The door had been open when I arrived. Maybe whoever stayed here just hadn't come back yet. Or maybe they were nearby. I stood up and backed toward the door. I wasn't planning on staying any longer. But before I could step out, I heard something outside. A faint crunch, like footsteps on dry leaves. It came from the side of the cabin, near where the trees started again. My whole body went still. I waited, but it didn't come again. I didn't want to look, but I did. I stepped off the porch and looked toward the treeline. Nothing, just the gray stretch of forest and the thin fog starting to roll through. I walked to the car quickly, trying not to make too much noise. When I opened the door and got in, I realized my hands were shaking a little. I started the engine, but before I drove off, I looked one last time at the cabin. From the car, it looked almost peaceful. The kind of quiet place you'd never think could carry so much weight. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The curtain in the back window, the one I thought was gone, was moving slightly. Not from wind. The air outside was still. I didn't wait any longer. I pressed the gas and drove down that narrow dirt road as fast as I could without losing control. The trees blurred past, and the road felt endless. When I finally reached the main highway, I stopped for a moment to catch my breath. My chest felt tight, and my throat was dry. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal, maybe just air shifting inside. But the longer I sat there, the more wrong it felt. A week later, I read something online. A small article from a local paper. It said a hiker had gone missing near the old lake in northern Montana. They found his camp abandoned a few miles from an old cabin. Inside that cabin, the sheriff found signs of someone living there. Food cans, blankets, clothes, and a note written on a piece of paper stuck under a mug on the table. It said, asterisk, he comes back sometimes. Asterisk, they never said who wrote it. That was the last I heard about it. But even now, sometimes at night, when I think about that road, I remember the way the air felt standing in that cabin. The quiet, the smell of rot and dust, and the faint prints on the floor leading nowhere. I tell myself it was just some drifter trying to survive the cold, but deep down I know there was something else in that place. Not something unreal, not a ghost or a story, just something human that stayed behind too long. And every time I drive through the north side of Montana now, I make sure never to take that road again. Because some places aren't haunted by what's dead. They're haunted by what's left alive inside them. It was early November of 1996 when I drove up the old county road leading into the northern woods of Montana. The sky was a flat, gray sheet, heavy with the kind of cold that seeps through a man's jacket and into his bones. The trees had long lost their leaves, leaving only the black, naked outlines of branches scratching at the dull sky. I had rented a small hunting cabin for the week, far from town, wanting silence after a rough year at work. I told myself it was just to clear my head, to get away from the constant noise and the city lights that kept me awake. The road leading to the cabin was hardly a road anymore. More like two faded tire tracks half swallowed by weeds and mud. My truck bounced over the frozen ground, the tires slipping here and there as the cold wind whistled through the cracks of the window. I remember seeing a sign nailed to a pine tree at the turnoff, so faded I could barely make out the words, "Private land, no trespassing." But I had already paid for the cabin through some listing I found in the local newspaper. The directions had been handwritten in smudged ink on a scrap of paper. No real address, just a few landmarks and a vague, "Drive until you see the creek." By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had started to sink, the light fading to that dim blue that makes everything look colder than it already is. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by thick trees, the kind that pressed in close and let in almost no wind. It was smaller than I expected, the wood dark and rough, like it hadn't been cared for in years. The windows were covered in grime, and the front steps sagged under my boots. When I opened the door, the smell hit me first. Old wood, dust, and something else faintly metallic, like rust. Inside was simple: a wood stove in the corner, a small table, one chair, and a cot pushed against the far wall. There were tools hung on the wall: an axe, a shovel, and a saw that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The air was still and cold, the kind of cold that felt alive, creeping into every crack and corner. I unpacked slowly, lighting a few candles I'd brought, since there was no power. I started a fire in the stove, and the warmth spread slowly, filling the cabin with that dry heat that makes your skin itch. I spent the first night listening to the wind scrape against the roof. Every small noise stood out: the creak of the wood, the sound of ice melting somewhere on the metal roof, the shifting of branches outside. I tried to sleep, but the silence was too deep, too perfect, the kind of quiet that made you aware of your own breathing. When I finally did fall asleep, it was restless, shallow, and filled with strange dreams of being watched from outside. The next morning, frost covered everything. The ground sparkled under the dull sun, and my breath came out in white clouds. I spent the day gathering wood, walking down to the creek that ran a few hundred yards away. The water was half frozen, and there were old tire tracks pressed into the mud along the bank, fresh enough that they hadn't filled with snow yet. I hadn't seen another car since I left town, so the sight of them made me uneasy. Maybe someone used this land too. Later that afternoon, I found a second trail behind the cabin. It wasn't marked, just a narrow path cutting through the trees, almost hidden. Curiosity got the better of me and I followed it. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Even the wind stopped. After about 10 minutes of walking, I came across something strange. A rusted metal drum half buried in the dirt. The lid was missing, and the inside was filled with blackened wood and ash. Around it, I saw small bits of fabric and melted plastic. It looked like someone had burned trash, but there were also small white fragments in the ash that didn't look like wood. I didn't think much of it then. I just turned back before it got dark. That night, something woke me up. It wasn't a sound at first, more like a feeling that something had changed. The fire had gone out, and the cabin was pitch black except for a thin strip of moonlight leaking through the window. I could hear a faint crunching sound outside, slow, steady footsteps in the frozen dirt. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. The steps moved around the cabin, pausing near the window, then the door. I stayed still, not even breathing, staring at the ceiling and hoping it was just an animal. But the steps were too heavy, too careful. Eventually, they stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, waiting for them to start again, but they never did. When morning came, I went outside to look. There were footprints in the dirt, big ones, boot prints circling the cabin once. They led toward the woods and disappeared. I should have packed up right then and left, but part of me didn't want to believe what I saw. I told myself it could have been a hunter, maybe someone who got lost or was checking their traps. I stayed another day, chopping wood and keeping the fire going. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me from somewhere in the trees. That evening, as the sky turned the color of ash, I went to fetch more wood from the pile out back. That's when I noticed something new. A piece of fabric caught on a branch near the trail. It looked like the corner of a jacket, torn and stiff with dirt. When I pulled it free, I saw dark stains on it, old and dried. I dropped it right there. My hands were shaking. I went back inside, bolted the door, and pushed the table in front of it. The night dragged on endlessly. The wind picked up, howling through the cracks in the wood, and I could hear branches snapping in the distance. Then, just before dawn, I heard it again, the crunch of footsteps outside, slower this time. They stopped right by the door. I sat there, frozen, staring at the handle, waiting for it to turn. It never did. I didn't move until daylight broke through the window. When I finally stepped outside, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Behind the cabin, a few yards from the tree line, the ground was disturbed. The dirt had been turned up like something had been buried there recently. The shape was uneven, long, maybe 6 feet. My stomach twisted. I dug just enough to see a torn boot sticking out of the earth. I didn't dig any deeper. I knew what it was. My hands went cold even though I was sweating. I ran back to the cabin, grabbed my bag, and left everything else behind. I drove down that dirt road so fast I nearly wrecked the truck twice. I didn't stop until I saw the first gas station miles away. When I got there, I told the clerk there was a dead body behind the cabin I rented. He called the sheriff. They went up there that afternoon. Later, I got a call from them. They told me there were 3 bodies buried behind that cabin. All men, all missing within the last 5 years. The property owner had been in jail for a while for something else, some assault charge. No one had checked the cabin since. I never went back for my things. Sometimes I still think about those nights. The sound of footsteps circling the cabin, the footprints in the dirt, the feeling of being watched. I try to tell myself it was just my nerves, that I imagined half of it. But deep down, I know I didn't. Someone had been up there, moving around that cabin while I slept. Maybe the man who buried them never really left. And sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night in my apartment, I can still hear that slow crunching sound in my head. The sound of boots walking circles around a lonely cabin in the woods. It was late October of 1998 when the department sent me out to the northern side of Pine Hollow, a stretch of countryside that didn't get much attention unless something bad happened. I was 39, a deputy for almost a decade, and had spent most of my career dealing with the usual drunk fights, speeding tickets, missing livestock calls. But that Friday morning was different. The dispatcher's voice on the radio was quiet, almost hesitant. A hiker had found what looked like a body near an old hunting cabin deep in the woods. No other details, just coordinates and a request to check it out. The drive out there took nearly 2 hours. The sun was still low, pale orange light cutting through a blanket of fog. The road narrowed the deeper I went, and soon the asphalt turned to gravel, then dirt. The trees leaned in close, damp leaves brushing against my side mirror. The air smelled like wet soil and pine. I didn't pass a single car the entire way. By the time I reached the cabin, the fog had thickened. The place looked like it hadn't seen a person in years. The wood siding was gray and warped, the small porch sagging under the weight of moss and rot. A single window on the side had been boarded up, while the front one was cracked. The hiker's orange tape fluttered from a branch near the clearing, marking where he'd stopped. I parked beside an old stump, turned off the engine, and stepped out. Everything was quiet except for the sound of my boots pressing into wet leaves. The smell hit me first, something faint but foul, something that didn't belong in the forest. I followed it past the cabin toward a small embankment. The ground sloped down to a shallow creek. That's where I saw it. A man, face down, half covered in mud and leaves. His clothes were soaked through. I could tell he hadn't been there long, maybe a day or two, but the dampness was already doing its work. His right arm was twisted awkwardly under him. I didn't see any drag marks, no signs of animals, just him lying still. I took out my notebook, wrote down what I could. Mid-40s, brown jacket, jeans, boots. No wallet, no phone. His fingertips were pale and pruned, like he'd been in water. I called it in over the radio, but the signal was spotty. My words cut in and out. They said they'd send backup, though I knew that could take hours out here. I decided to wait near the cabin and keep an eye on the area. Inside, the cabin was even worse than it looked outside. Dust hung in the air, thick and gray. There was an old cot against the wall, a rusted lantern on the floor, and a pile of empty cans in one corner. Someone had been there not long ago. The ashes in the small stove were still faintly warm when I touched them. I found a coffee mug sitting on the table, a ring of dried liquid stuck to the bottom. I checked every corner, every shadow. The smell of damp wood mixed with that faint, sickly odor drifting in from outside. The silence was heavy. Even the birds had gone quiet. I kept my jacket zipped and my hand close to my holster out of habit more than fear, but something about that place felt off. Not like danger exactly, more like I had arrived too late for something important. After about 30 minutes, I went back outside to check on the body again. It was still there, untouched, but now I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A second set of footprints leading down from the cabin to the creek. Larger, deeper ones heading straight toward where the man lay. They didn't come back. That meant someone else had been here after the man died, or maybe while he was dying. I crouched down and studied the prints. The edges were sharp, not softened by rain or dew, which meant they were recent. My radio hissed with static when I tried to call it in again. I decided to follow them for a bit, keeping my hand near my gun. The tracks led along the creek, through thick brush, and into a clearing where the ground flattened. There I found tire marks, 2 distinct lines carved into the mud. Someone had driven out of there not long ago. The tracks looked like those from a small pickup or an SUV. I took a few photos, then followed them for about 100 yards before the path disappeared into harder ground. The woods were still. No wind, no sound. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating. I turned back toward the cabin, But as I walked, I started noticing small things I hadn't before. A cigarette but near a tree stump, a crumpled receipt from a gas station about 30 miles south, and what looked like a torn strip of fabric snagged on a branch. It was dark blue, maybe from a jacket. I pocketed it. When I reached the cabin again, something felt different. The door was slightly open. I was sure I had closed it earlier. My pulse quickened. I stepped inside slowly, flashlight in hand. The room looked the same, except the mug on the table was gone. I stood there for a long minute, listening. The only sound was the faint creak of the walls settling. I checked around the cabin but found nothing. I told myself maybe I'd imagined closing the door. The air was thick, and I could feel sweat forming on my neck despite the chill. I waited another hour for backup that didn't come. The sun had dipped low by then, orange fading into gray. I walked back to my truck to call in again, but when I reached it, the radio was dead, completely silent. The only thing I could do was wait it out until morning. I decided to stay in the cabin overnight. I brought my flashlight, my sidearm, and a thermos of coffee I'd kept in the truck. I locked the door, pushed a chair against it, and sat on the cot. I didn't sleep much. Every few minutes, I'd hear something faint outside, a twig snapping, leaves shifting. Once, I thought I heard footsteps circling the cabin, slow and deliberate, but when I looked out the window, there was nothing. By sunrise, I was exhausted. I stepped outside, blinking at the light, and froze. The body by the creek was gone, just a dark patch of wet ground where it had been. The mud was disturbed, fresh footprints everywhere. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I followed the prints, 2 sets this time, back toward the road. They led straight past the cabin and into the trees. Then they vanished near the tire marks I'd seen yesterday. Whoever had come back had taken the body with them. When backup finally arrived around noon, they found me standing by the creek, still staring at the spot where the man had been. We searched the woods for hours but found nothing. No truck, no body, no new evidence. The only proof I had was my notes and the few photos I'd taken on my old film camera. A week later, the department said it might have been a hunting accident, that maybe the hiker was mistaken about the body's position. They filed it away like nothing had happened. But I knew what I saw. The body was there. Someone came back for it. Someone who had been watching. Even now, when I think about that day, what haunts me most isn't the body. It's the cabin. The warmth in those ashes, the missing mug, the footprints that never returned. Someone had been living there, someone who didn't want to be found. I never went back to Pine Hollow after that, but sometimes, late at night, I still dream about that morning. The fog, the smell of damp wood, and that quiet moment when I realized I wasn't alone out there. And every time I wake up, I can still hear the soft creak of that cabin door opening, just before the silence falls again.